Mr. Mark Vanderwall, thanks for joining me for another session of Reef Therapy.
I dig your T-shirt, man.
Oh, thank you very much. We'll have to get you one if you know the right people. We might be able to sort it out.
I got a gray one, but the black one's pretty cool.
Very
I like
cool.
that.
Well, we without further ado, we're going to just jump right into this 26th session of Reef Therapy, and this was a topic that you kind of spearheaded, kind of our notes and in the background. So why don't you tell the listeners and viewers what it is we are going to discuss in today's session?
Yeah, so there's always talk about when we talk about reef keeping and recommendations and tools and additives, and a lot of it rests on anecdotal observations, right? Which, being a very visual reef keeper, I can respect, but something that I've pondered about a lot is, some of these questions that I have, if I had, let's just say hypothetically, the budget, the means, the time, the space, what are some of those things that I would love to take out of the anecdotal zone and actually either run some experiments, run some tests, do some data-driven things, and actually come up with some answers on. Some of it is just, things that people always talk about and just say, well, this is true. And I'm like, well, is it? Other stuff is more, it doesn't originate out of distrust, but it's like I'm being told or marketed that something works a certain way, but I'd love to validate that. I'd love to have some type of independent lab certified, hey, yep, that's how this thing works. So it's more like if we had, if I was a billionaire and I didn't have to work and I had a big old space, kind of like what you do to, do my reef keeping in a larger sense or a larger space, like what are some of the things that I would love to find answers to that I think a lot of people would probably feel the same way about.
Yeah, so. No, I think in a roundabout way, what you're trying to say is like, what could we verify with science, or at least some degree of verifiable testing? Because like you said, a lot of manufacturers come at us with so many claims. I mean, every Reef Aquarium light package says it's the best light. Every protein skimmer and now it's just gotten so hyperbolic in our marketing culture that you just write best. You just write best on everything you have, right? The food, the additive, the skimmer, the light, the pump, and then worry about any kind of tangible metrics to compare it to other things. And I feel like, this is not even exclusive to aquariums, but I mean, you're talking about, I don't know, face creams and disinfectants and car, gasoline, fuel, computers. First line, best, just best.
Yeah, and sometimes it boils down to the most popular or widely used product is the one with the best marketing. Right, mm-hmm. But when you do see cases in other industries or other hobbies, sometimes it's surprising that it's like the underdog that when actual testing occurs is the winner, right? Is the better product.
Well, I mean, any company only has a given amount of resources, right? And just like running for Congress or president, it's not a verifiable like who's best. It's just who's most popular, right? So does an aquarium company or any other company, do they spend their money on marketing dollars, or do they spend their money on research and development?
Yeah.
And it's hard to tease those things out because you see, here's the other thing. Like you see, one thing I've wrestled with for years is covering new products, brand new product companies or categories. Day one, they're the best. Like their marketing just literally says that no one has ever actually used their product. No one has compared their product, but on the box it says best. Just right out the gate. And I think as consumers, we've probably collectively gotten a little bit smarter and can tease apart that market speak. But this, this discussion that we're about to have is like, what if we could just cut through all that? And what kind of experiments? Like we don't even know exactly what experiments need to happen, right? We're just saying it'd be nice for some of these things to actually be verified. And I love how this conversation has a lot of overlap with some of the messages that we talk about, right? Like previous episode is like things that make the reef aquarium hobby harder. That's bullshit marketing. That's one of them. Or not using the right names. You cannot do research if you're calling a pump a whirligig or a light a doodad, right? Like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to make the aquarium hobby overall a lot more progressive.
Yeah, and oh man, what was I about to say? Something that I've heard a lot as a saying is, anything can be accomplished as long as you don't care who gets the credit. And if there's a guy out there with lots of disposable income and is like, you know what, I'm going to go set that up and do that, that's great, right? Like some of these, I think, yeah, it'd be awesome if somebody picked up that torch and did it. But I think, it's tricky too, because you're going to get questions on your method, right? Or your approach. Like I really do appreciate that there are people testing lights and measuring PAR and, measuring biodiversity, for example, like by different tank setups. Like that stuff is very interesting to observe, right? But and I sympathize in those people in those shoes, because eventually somebody's going to pick it apart, right? And say, well, you didn't do. So that's the other piece of it, is like the method, like you said, could be called into question, but at least it'd be better than just the anecdotal or the marketing that, it'd be something. I think we could learn a lot from it too. I think maybe if we pick apart some of these things, we actually end up with a better product in the long run as well, right? We challenge things to get better.
And one thing that I've lamented with a few of my fellow, influencers, is that we are almost never shown a product, an additive, a pump, a light, or whatever, until it's like late prototype, early production. It's very, very rare that they're like, hey man, we really want to take this next generation or this new product to the next level. How would you approach this? I'm not talking about like just completely stealing the thunder but just a little bit of feedback. When I did the studio, I reached out to everyone who had anything like it, and I visited as many people and tried to pick up as many pointers as possible. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is like the collective, there's a lot of intelligence in the community and the collective, especially if they're using some critical thinking skills.
That's a good point. I think pulling people in early, beyond the beta testing, but just, there's some complexity around that.
Before the molds and the tooling is completed, like there might be some little things, or just even the software. There's certain things, but I feel like we're getting more than usual.
And you can have people sign NDAs and all of that fun stuff, right?
All the time.
So, all right. So you want to start with one, or you want me to start with one?
I think I just need to start with a little mini rant.
Sure.
Because this really feeds into what we're talking about. And it's the importance of names. When you're doing science, you can't do science on a particular strain of coral and call it, Laura's purple areolas. You know what I mean? You can't, that doesn't fly, right? Or you can't describe certain creatures growing in your tank as little wormy things. Like, at least just pick up a book and try to like identify it down to like a broad group. Or like, how many of our coral pests are being described as red bugs or black bugs? First of all, bug is a thing. It's a specific order of insecta. And the black bugs are ciliates and the red bugs are copepods. It's like, it's not that hard. Just drill down a little bit. And so it's like, that's one of the reasons that you and I rail against like silly names. It's keeping the hobby back. It's holding us back from being able to make progress. Like, first we have to know what I'm talking about, what you're talking about, what everybody's talking about. And then if we want to approach a scientist or someone who wants to do some objective testing about it, then we have some place to start. So that's my mini rant. And then after that, I just want to give a couple shout outs to Adam Wang and Jamie Craggs. So Adam Wang, we've been dealing with these coral pests for like 15, 20-ish years. Over the last 2 or 3 years, he has come up with new or improved pest species descriptions for Montipora nudibranch, for acropora eating flatworms, and I want to say 1 or 2 others, but he's put a name to them, and he's, placed them taxonomically, so we have that starting point of knowing how to deal with it. And the thing that was amazing about his research is he did some of the tests to figure out like the actual life cycle of Montipora eating nudibranch, the actual life cycle of acropora eating flatworms. And if he just called them AEFWs or nudies, like that doesn't get anywhere. And then Jamie Craggs has been doing, the real science of coral spawning. But maybe that's not what we're talking about here, but those are 2 folks that are definitely pushing the actual envelope when it comes to doing the kind of research and science that we want, so that there's information and facts and details that we can rely on.
Oh, see, now you've queued something up that I should know the answer for later. Give me a second. Well, because I want to give credit where credit is due on one of these. Hold on 1 second.
Well, while you're doing that,
yeah, you start.
I'm a vlogger, and I've been writing about reef aquarium products for a very long time. And I gotta say, man, I'm incredibly jealous of people who review cars, who review electronics, home computers, mobile devices, because there's just so much less gray area than there is in the saltwater aquarium world. We don't even have like pillars of understanding of like as a foundation to stand on, whereas I can watch a bunch of different YouTube tech bloggers, and they're all saying similar things because they're running the same like performance benchmarks, and they're comparing it to each other. Whereas here in the reef aquarium hobby, you have to develop the benchmarks to test anything, and it's just really, really hard. Did you find your thing?
I did, yeah.
All right.
But that'll be for later.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in regards to one of the topics that I've talked about in the past, but it's just somebody's recent accomplishments made me kind of think, hey, that's not directly applicable, but it shows that there's a way that we can get quantitative answers about things. But anyway, all right. I guess I'll start.
Go ahead.
So I ran a calcium reactor from, I'm going to say 2002 to probably about 2018. And then I switched back to dosing for various reasons, which are not relevant to the conversation. But one of the big things that's hyped about two-parting is that it's a balanced solution, right? And the big one is, the right ratio of sodium and chloride, right? Sodium in the carbonates, chloride in the calcium chloride. The two mix, they create salt. Salt water, your salinity gradually goes up, but that's a relatively benign side effect to dosing that can be easily remediated. But really, when you look at like the balling method and the origins of two-part is that once you try to remediate that salinity by diluting it with fresh water, what you are also bringing down is all of the trace elements, right?
Everything.
Yeah. So the salt goes back to normal, but the trace elements go down. And a lot of these two-part additives do a lot of marketing, if you read their labels, that they also add trace elements in a balanced ratio so that I shouldn't speak out of turn on that, because if you read the marketing on a lot of these, they don't necessarily spell out that, hey, if you dilute, the salinity creep with fresh water, don't worry, we've compensated your strontium, your magnesium, and everything for that, right? But they do talk about how they add trace elements. So one of the things I'd love to test long term is these different trace element additives, and are they when we talk about balanced, like, can we talk about beyond the sodium chloride piece and talk about like those trace elements? Like, are some of these additives truly balanced? Now, I know Tropic Marin is one that really expounds on that, and they're very transparent about that. So, but some of these other ones, like I use one, right? But even if you read the ESV label, the Reef code label, all of them, they mention adding trace elements, but they don't necessarily dive into that. And so I'm kind of curious, like, is there a trace element dilution that happens over time with two parts? And, you know, I think that's testable, right? I don't think that's too hard to do. And you could compare it to different products.
You're going straight into the deep end here.
Hell yeah,
just
man.
Like way down on my list. Once we warmed up a little bit, I was just like, where did I put it? What trace elements actually do?
Well, that was the next one. Yeah, I figured we'd go there as well. Yeah.
You know, oh my God, this already, I'm realizing this is a tough conversation because, like, we don't know what trace elements actually do. ICP testing is supposed to help, but I feel like ICP service testing service providers, they should be continuously doing like internal audits to prove to people that their tests are accurate. Right? Okay, so it's one thing that if you get a batch of salt and it's got an ICP test on it from not like aquarium people, and it's got a batch number, so you can like go back and trace that back. And why don't we have ICP tests for ICP tests? Does that make sense? Like show me how you've run the standard on this week or this day's batch of tests that we can take to the bank that their tests are accurate, right? So we've already heard this because we can't have a conversation about two-part dosing and trace element stability and dilution unless
if you don't trust the testing.
If we don't know that our
mechanism.
tests are actually, coming back accurately about ICP tests, about trace elements, and on and on and on. It's just like it is a Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. Like, all right, well, where do we start with this? So, but yeah, I agree with you with the with the trace elements. And the thing is, like, Triton's been around for a long time, and it's supposed to be scientific. It's supposed to be science, right? But if you send in an ICP test, you know what it tells you about certain elements? Oh, you're green, you're yellow, you're red. Thanks, buddy. Thanks, buddy. And every time I want to know what that actual element does, either because it's red for being too low or it's red from being too high, I go to Google Scholar, type in live coral vanadium or, dead coral tungsten, and you just have to weed through all this literature. And then if you find something that's kind of close, you kind of skim it trying to find if it's even testing what you want. But it's just like the onus should be on the additive makers. Man, you know what? These additive makers have been making so much money off of us for like 30 years. How many of them have demonstrated what strontium actually does or what level of strontium is good for an aquarium? How high can it be? How low can it be? Well, and these companies they've just been cashing in, selling us basically the bottle, because the packaging of the bottle costs less than the elements that are in there. And like, none of them have done this research. I think I'll say this every few sessions of Reef Therapy. I keep looking over at the reptile world, seeing companies like ZoomEd verifying how much UV like different types of reptiles need, and then what kind of products produce the kind of UV ultraviolet that they actually need. And you look at the reef aquarium world, and it should be the most technical. It should be. We're using $200,000 machines to try and give us some readings of trace elements, but they're not like verifying that their machines are working, and they're not doing any, and the additive makers aren't doing any kind of testing to let us know, hey, you know what? You really want to keep your zinc at 1 part per billion.
Oh, well, let's just assume ICP is totally accurate, right?
Sure.
Let's just make that. No, but I can respect going at it from the angle of natural seawater levels, right? Like, look, we chose this as our standard, right? Our gold standard. This reef in this place, that's a healthy coral reef, right? And we took the test there, and these are the numbers, and these are the numbers that we advocate for your reef tank. And we can't tell you what strontium is going to do if it's too high or too low, but at least we can tell you that you're within range of the natural seawater levels on, in this location that we chose as a gold standard. But when I'm adding a solution, right, and it tells me how much to add to raise my calcium or alkalinity per gallons, but it doesn't tell me anything about how it's going to impact my trace elements. It just tells me that, hey, we add trace elements too, don't worry.
That's another thing. Sorry, you're just pushing my buttons in all the wrong ways.
That's what I would like to see is like, okay, can I actually maintain natural seawater levels if I do that dilution correction, right? Or
you and I have been keeping reef tanks since it was just 2-part, and then we saw 3-part, and then we saw balling, and I'm just like, all right, well, whatever. You're just adding to the recipe. Balling is just 2-part expanded, right? But then you have companies like Triton, like I'm just going to put them on the spot because they've been advocating for science all along, and they don't tell you your chlorinity. Right? Sodium and chloride are the most abundant ions in the tank. You and I are the only people talking about like salinity drift. You know how many people are using 2-part, and they some people also are very proud of how rarely they do water changes for the sake of going on the bulletin boards and saying, "Oh, look at me, my reef tank hasn't had a water change in a year." And what is that tipping point? But why does a kind of the first ICP test provider, why don't they talk about chlorinity? The levels of the sodium and the chloride ions and them getting out of whack and having salinity drift and how to deal with it. You know what I'm saying? Because that's what you're talking about, right? The raising sodium chloride ions. If you dilute them, you dilute everything else that's just how it goes.
No, and I think it was Lou Eccles from Tropic Marin. He did a MACNA talk on it, and I thought it was one of the most valuable talks, and I was surprised more people weren't talking about it, right? I ran a calcium reactor and didn't do a water change for a year, and I did an ICP test, and a lot of my trace elements were within range and unaffected, and that blew my mind too, because I was like, there's no way in hell. I'd love to think that a calcium reactor is a holistic trace element solution, additive, right? Because I'm melting some corals, but it's just something in my gut tells me that that's not how things work, right? Those old coral skeletons that have been mined up are not going to always be the best source for all things that get depleted. So I was a little shocked that a lack of water change for 12 months in a heavily populated tank with a lot of SPS, and I didn't see much trace element drift. And so then I'm like, well, to your point, what are these trace elements doing, right? I've never seen magnesium. People always talk about magnesium. I've never experienced low magnesium in my tanks, and I don't know why. I truly don't. I'd love a chemist to chime in on what's going on there.
Maybe you just need a lot more Montes, because I find that Montes, again, this is the science part. Like I wish this could be explained. I find that Montes soak up magnesium more than Acropora, which doesn't make any sense because they're really closely related. Like if you told me that bird's nests and Possoporas and Stylophoras, if you told me that they pulled out magnesium more, I would kind of believe it because their skeleton feels different. It's a little bit more ceramic. It makes that ting sound when you cut it and when you break it. And Stylophoras is especially it'll burn through a blade. I'm not talking about aquarium grown colonies, right? I'm talking about wild colonies. When you cut through that, it is like dense marble. And so maybe it's just these kind of groups of corals just pull out 2 to 3% more magnesium versus some other corals, and over a long period of time it creates that drift. I don't remember your tanks having too many Montes throughout the years.
Yeah, I used to have caps. The only SBS I have 2 SBS in my tank right now. One is a digitata, right? So And then, I am guilty of just letting coralline go nuts. And I've always been told coralline is a magnesium hog, but I don't know. I just don't see it, And maybe my reactor media was covering it. Maybe my 2-part dosing, which claims to have magnesium in it, is covering it, right? I remember thinking from a visual reef keeping standpoint that Bionic was superior because of those trace elements, because I did see differences when I used it over some other 2-parts. But then
I've since been one trace element, right? And you know what's funny about that? That trace element might not have been there on purpose. That trace element could have been a contaminant of like the specific like calcium chloride or carbonate source that they used, or magnesium source. It might not have even been on purpose. It could have been one thing that your corals were missing, that was showing it like a tangible effect in your reef tank.
But I mean, now I use,
because we don't have the science.
Well, and I switched to a product that's about 7 times more concentrated because it's more affordable, right? And I don't have to refill the container as much.
Why are you calling it a product? You don't want to say what it is?
Sure, yeah.
I don't know. I literally don't know.
What's the company? Brightwell Reef Code.
Oh, okay.
Based on some of the chemistry calculators online, it was like, oh, you got to add 70 mLs a day of this, and it was like, oh, you only have to add 10 of Reef Code.
Are you so using the liquid or the powder?
The liquid.
Oh, okay.
Which I also like, because I can order a gallon and it's already pre-mixed, and I know I respect Bionic or ESV for shipping it, and then you add your RO to save on shipping costs. But just getting it all to fully dissolve is such a pain in the butt, man.
Yeah.
So I like that it's just pre-mixed, and the only time I have to do anything is in the winter time. It arrives cold. I'll stick it in a warm bath. But then I have questions like, nothing in this world is free, right? So at 7 times the concentration, I mean, is it Rob Stark of ESV? Mm-hmm. He's a smart chemist, right? I respect him highly. Some of this ratio of concentration's got to be for some chemistry reasons as well, right? So I Reef Code, I've been on it for 2 years and it works great. I have no issues with it, but I have questions. I'd love to do some analysis.
Just touched on like one of the most important points of why the science is not being front and center in the reef aquarium hobby. And I know that certain manufacturers, they'll tell you face to face, straight up, they can't like put out their chemical formulas. Bob Stark, because I'm chief among them, is like, I mean, this is how I make my money.
Yeah, it's the Coca-Cola recipe. You don't
if I
put
teach
it in
everybody how to do X and Y and Z, then everybody else will do it, and then there's nothing special. But it's like, all right, how do you walk that fine line between actually promoting science, like real science, versus the smoke and mirrors, the mysticism of like, oh, this is the best product ever. How do you walk that line as a commercial entity? I don't. Here's the thing. Like, I'm going to use the reptile guys as an example. I feel like a lot of their basic biological science has been made publicly available for zoos and public aquariums, and there's not, I mean, all right, maybe you're making a food or you're making a product, but the actual biology that's happening, that is probably more common knowledge than certainly the multivariate matrices of like chemistry and biology and physics that happens in our coral reef aquariums.
Yeah, but
I feel like it's
I've got a good question about that, right? Like, it's all mathematical, right? It's all calculatable. Is that even a word? Probably not. If your salinity goes up this much, right, then your trace elements should increase at a correlative or proportional amount, so that when you dilute it, it comes back down. Now, the cons to that is, hey, you know what? It's okay if your salinity creeps up, but if we were to compensate your, I don't know, pick strontium, right, and we increase that proportionally, we might get into a toxic situation. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, right? So, but that would be a good answer of like, well, we can't balance all trace elements proportionally because you could get into like a danger zone with some of these things. So we don't mess with those, right? But again, document that. Tell me, like, I don't think there's any secret sauce to like the ratio of strontium to sodium chloride in natural seawater. And I mean, if you can tell me that if I add 500 mLs of your product, my DKH is going to go up by this much per gallon. I mean, it's all, I don't know. Where's the secret recipe? It's all just it's a proportional dosage of everything, right?
I think there's certain like trade secrets that can be kept secret, but you can still skirt that, that intellectual property. You can still like talk facts, talk science, talk some tangible details that you and I want to know, but until the average reefer is more concerned with the name of some coral that is coming from a farm by the thousands and the made-up name that's been attached to it in their region, which is not the same made-up name that's attached to it on the other coast or another country or another continent, we're not going to have any advancements, the real tangible advancements. The thing about the books, the science in the books that you and I have been discussing is all the same. The technology and the methodology has changed, but the basic science has not really been advanced very much. I would like to switch gears a little bit, and let's talk about.
Well, let me say one last thing.
Okay,
on
go
it.
ahead. Go ahead.
Like take Red Sea. I haven't used their products, but I'm aware that their advice on how to dose their trace elements is calculated based on how much calcium and A and B you add. So their instructions are, if you add this many mLs of A and B to keep your calcium and alk right, then dose this many mLs of these trace elements. Again, it's a proportional ratio, right? Like, to me, it makes sense. I'm not a chemist, and there's probably a chemist listening to this getting angry and pulling his hair out, but I apologize, but it's just, to me, these are, again, based on the subject, right, of this, or the topic. I would love to know more. I would love to learn more. I mean, I'd love to hear people in the comments that are chemists explain it like I'm 5. I would love to understand.
That's a really interesting approach, the Red Sea approach, the Red Sea Reef Care Program.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense. But as a scientist, you know that it's reductionist. It's reducing the ratios of what are being absorbed by the reef. That might have those.
Well, to your point, right? Calcium, acropora and montipora may absorb certain elements at different ratios, right? So it's hard to.
I know there's been plenty of research done on like wild coral reefs where they basically drop a cage, right, like a plexiglass cage down on a slice of reef, and they measure the consumption, right? So was that ratio come about by doing that with like a chunk of reef, which counts everything in there, right? All the bristleworms, the polychaetes, annelids, the sponges, the crustaceans, all the copepods, But if you talk to some people who actually subscribe to the Red Sea Reef Care Program, they'll straight tell you to cut all those trace elements in half. I think we've gotten those comments before here on Reef Therapy. That
interesting.
Yeah, it's cool. It's simple, it's elegant, but it's very reductionist. And one thing that I've usually said about additives, especially non-stoichiometric ones, like besides calcium and alkaline magnesium, is like they have no idea how much you should add. They have no idea. They are picking a number almost out of thin air. They grew some ketomorph for a little while. It's like, all right, throw some keto at it with this much like iron and manganese. Or they grew a certain amount of coral for it. All right, well, we added this much and this is fine. They're just kind of picking a number. But just like the fish food that you get from the big box stores, they say, ooh, how much can your fish eat in 3 to 5 minutes? Everybody knows if you feed your fish for 3 to 5 minutes straight, 3 times a day, twice a day, you're going to have an explosion in your tank of like nutrients, right? So I think the best approach is to just cut whatever they're saying, cut it down by half, usually.
Yeah, it's like there's not much when it comes to the interface between those products and the customer or the folks that manufacture product. It deviates from reef chemistry to reef alchemy, right?
Absolutely.
It's
totally.
and that annoys me, I guess. I don't know. I would love to A and B these products, right? And do different tests and see like what happens to different trace elements. And if I'm a billionaire, I'll set up a Montipora dedicated tank and an Acropora tank and see if consumption rates are different, right? And then this goes into sort of like your talk about what do these trace elements do? Like, oh, you have a soft coral tank, add iodine. Why? Like what? I add iodine and nothing happens, man. I don't know.
We've been told that forever and ever. You know what happens when I add iodine? I get better coralline growth.
Yeah.
Therefore, I do not add iodine because I do not want more coralline growth.
But let's A and B some tanks with iodine, without iodine, soft coral tanks. Is there even like what are the observable differences? I don't know. I'm just throw a coral in a blender, see how much iodine there was absorbed.
No, I feel like
I
this
don't know.
conversation is really good. It dovetails really nicely into our previous session on things that make the reef aquarium hobby harder. And
Yeah.
we are basically spotlighting and featuring all these things that we don't really know.
Right, we
You know,
just have the anecdotal, and that's the thing. You'll probably get
the
comments like,
anecdotes that have
"Well,
been
when I add
repeated
iodine,
for
my leather coral
decades.
looks happier." But that's again, we're trying to talk out of the anecdotal zone,
Yeah.
right? Because I love anecdotal. I live off of it, right, in my hobby. But again, I'm talking about if we were billionaires and we could just go to town on some of this stuff.
Oh
right?
yeah, but I wouldn't want to do it. I would tell this guy to do this thing. I would tell that guy to do this thing. I would tell this woman to do that thing. But
And they can tell me the results while I'm on my sailboat.
before we jump into a few more scientific topics, man, I really wish it'd be possible for there. There's always like so many different recipes for like new rock, or new injection molded parts,
Yeah.
or bearings, and oh man, I really wish there was like an underwriter's laboratory, UL or CE, for aquarium safety when it comes to man-made rock, to leaching, to durability. You know, the G-bow pumps that just lose magnetization after 6 months to a year, depending on how you run them. It's like, it's not fair. It's like, it's just borderline fraud, like scandalous, you know. And not to mention magnets. You see, I've been a fan of magnets forever. Therefore, I know that you have, like, every magnet will crack. Like it's exterior housing. Every single one will crack. It's just a matter of time. You need like space grade, aerospace grade plastic that is very expensive, because no matter what kind of plastic you think you're working with, it absorbs water. Moisture goes through it. And as soon as you get a little bit of moisture on your ferromagnet or rare earth magnet, of course it corrodes, it swells, and it cracks the plastic. And there's just like, how many of these products are going to fail within a month to a year to 3 years? You know, I was just talking to Evan today, and he was talking about how his bubble magus hadn't failed him for 4 or 5 years. And I was like, maybe it was less than that. And I was like, well, what does that tell you? And he's all like, well, it tells me I got a good deal. That's not his voice. He sounds just like me. I was like, that tells me that it's probably on the verge of failing. You know what I mean? And it's just like, you have to do this weird Occam's razors. Like, you've used it for this much amount of time. You haven't had any problems so far. Vis-a-vis, you're probably due for your calcium channel to fail like it did and cause your alkalinity to spike, you know? So yeah, I wish there was a little bit more of a responsibility from the community at large to verify and demonstrate not just that their ICP tests are accurate today or this week or this month, but that product that you put in water, especially the electrical and magnetic ones, is going to exhibit a certain amount of durability. Because man, imagine, you know, you've heard this story before. I'm going to tell you a story like you've already heard it before, not even like specifically. Somebody's got a beautiful reef tank, their corals are growing awesome, and either magnetic mount or one of their return pumps just had an ingress of water, and it caused like copper to be leached into the tank, and they had to watch all of their work of like 2 to 5 years, however long, just go down the shitter over a period of like a few weeks to a few months because of one like few dollar part.
Corner, yeah. Well, I said in our last podcast, people go and argue about lights on the forums for months on end. And I'm like, your choice of lights is probably not going to be the downfall of your reef tank. It's the magnet in your sump or the heater, right? Like those tend to be very problematic pieces of equipment, but everything uses a magnet. I mean,
speaking of which, I just put out a video today. You probably haven't seen it yet.
I did. The $96 Nano.
Yeah,
I saw
that was
it,
very
man.
conservative. Man, I threw $30 at it for the tank and the lid, another $10 for shipping. So the actual gear, we're talking about.
I don't trust that
$50.
heater though. I was looking at the thing like,
I trust it more because I've
Really?
seen that design used in the reptile world for a long time. And you're talking about like big, beefy reptiles with a hard shell, like knocking that stuff around. And just the very fact that it said replace after 10,000 hours of heating, not of usage, right? And the
Yeah.
fact that there's a mode, you can press the button and it'll tell you how many hours it's operated. That low-key blew my mind. I did not expect that from a $14 heater, especially since the best we have nowadays is like, I don't know, like a $50 Ebo Jaeger.
that's actually
You
pretty
know,
cool
a few
that it
tight-
has not a screen, but like a little LED display where it could literally tell you, "Hey, it's time to replace me." Kind of like my fridge with the
No, it
fridge
does.
filter.
It
you know?
totally does. It has like an error code on it.
It's time to throw
would
me
it
the
have an
trash,
error
man.
code? Why would it have an error code on the display? And I looked it up. It's like, oh yeah, you have to replace it after 10,000 hours. I'm like, oh my God. It just low-key blew my mind. And that was coming
Yeah.
from a $14 product. So it's kind of fun to experiment and get away from the mainstream because there is 1,000, brown label, white label, brown bag products on Amazon. Some of them have to be good, right? Some of them have to have some good ideas.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's get a little bit more into the science.
All right.
Are you going to talk about lights or are you going to talk about protein skimmers?
Oh, they both sound good. Let's do protein skimmers. I may
Yeah,
need a
protein
beer
skimmers is
refill after
easier.
this one, though.
Protein skimmers is easier. We know in broad strokes what features of foam fractionation are supposedly the most important. You want small bubbles, a long contact time, a certain air-water ratio, and how much skimming is enough. But at what point do the bubbles become too small? At what point is your long contact time, okay, maybe you're pulling out more, but you're actually processing less because you're not pushing that air through, especially that air-water ratio. Here's the thing, man, we've been doing this thing for a long time. Ain't nobody know. Nobody really knows. We just made the
best article on skimming I ever read was Richard Harker back in the day. Do you remember that article?
I probably would if I read it, but we're talking a couple decades now.
Yeah, but yeah, to your point, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. And that was when he pointed out that an airstone driven skimmer outperformed his downdraft skimmer. but
oh yes, I remember that. He was all like, what happens if we just throw like a giant piston air pump and use air stones versus a downdraft skimmer? Didn't his downdraft like shut down?
Yeah, he was
he
able
running
to
them on the
shut
same
down
tank?
his downdraft, wasn't producing any more skimmate. Yeah.
That's
And
crazy.
his argument was contact time, right? Slower flow, more contact time. He even put bio balls in the airstone driven skimmer to slow things down, right? Slow the rise of the bubbles and stuff. Again, you could dive into the particulars and question like his methodology or like what he qualitatively decided was better. Sort of like dry versus wet skimmate. Like, has anybody really solved that one and said this is the best to go with, right?
Well, when it comes to protein skimming, man, it's part of my DNA. I just freaking love a protein skimmer. Even if I don't necessarily have to have one on my mini Zooxanthellae system, which I don't have. I don't have one of those. I still want one. I just feel like there's like that's one of those things. It's like putting a hat on with a certain dress. I'm just like, boom, you got a protein skimmer? Okay, you got a saltwater tank. That being said, I do not have a protein skimmer on my anemone rack yet because I'm like, I want the organics to stay in there. I want it to feed my anemones. But I've always had this thing that I haven't really articulated that well and haven't talked about openly very much. Is like a crummy protein skimmer is going to pull out the low-hanging protein, right? The heaviest proteins are going to be very easy to remove with a crummy protein skimmer. You know, a better protein skimmer is going to take them out faster. It's going to take out more, and you know it's probably going to work better. But a crummy protein skimmer, even just like an air-driven skimmer on a tank that's never had a skimmer, you barely even need a collection cup. The gunk will just build up on the walls, right?
Yeah, I was about to say.
And so, you know, I love protein skimmers. I think just like there's something alchemic about it, or something that you just, I don't know, it makes me happy. I love protein skimmers. They're super fun. But at some point you're like, well, do I need a better, bigger, more intense protein skimmer? But yeah, I'm actually really glad you referenced that one right there, because I've always thought about this low-hanging protein, how if you just had a tube with like a conical lip at the top, kind of like the old Mame nano skimmer
The glass ones, yeah.
on any tank, is it going to pull out like 50% of like the low-hanging protein and then just kind of leave some of the middle weight proteins in the tank for your stuff to eat? I don't know. I don't really know. I mean, conceptually, yes, I kind of do know that a little bit of skimming is going to take out some of those heavier proteins that are going to be nastier, you know, and degrade the most. But we just don't have the data. We don't have the information because refugiums have turned into algae scrubbers. You know, like we can't even like settle on certain names for things. But yeah, it'd be nice again, just like the additive guys, just like the ICP guys. How many have you ever seen like a protein skimmer company do a test? Like show brand A versus B versus C? You got like Turchek like 10 miles down the road, like ripping on every single. He says needle wheel protein skimmers don't work. Meanwhile, 99.9999% of skimmers in the world are needle wheels. I'm like, show me the metric by which your Venturi protein skimmer works good, or processes more water, or pulls out more skimmate per watt. But we're people, all of these aquarium companies, and I feel like this might be the main point of this session, they're not demonstrating anything, hardly anything. They're just putting a lot of things on a box. They're getting a few quotes from somebody who's popular on Instagram, and then they're just going out to reef shows and just pushing.
Yeah, I was going to say, even if you go into it and say, as a company, this was our goal, right? This is what we were chasing from a metric point of view, or something where you start to understand how they designed their skimmer, like why they made the choices that they did, right? And how they compared different designs and said, okay, we settled on this because here's why. And again, I mean, we talked about this in the past. I had a 300 liter per hour bubble magus skimmer just doing its thing, quiet. It's one of the seaside ones that had a Seache pump in it. I had it in a bookshelf for a while. I was like, I'll just throw that out in my new tank for a while. And then it was like, oh, I got some money, you know, birthday money. I'm gonna buy a new skimmer. But the little part of my brain was like, well, what are you trying to solve, right? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? And eventually, you know, marketing and, you know, the need to have a new toy took over my brain, and I bought a 600 liter per hour, much more expensive skimmer, the Deltec, and it skims great. I know
what you bought. You bought a manual net cleaner that happened to come with a protein skimmer.
Well, yeah, I think that's what sold me. Yeah, you know, it was an expensive upgrade, but I'll be honest, I haven't noticed any observable differences where I'm like, oh, see, once I went from 300 liter per hour to 600 liters per hour of air, this happened in my tank.
And I knew that you knew that at the time.
Yeah. Right? Oh, I knew full well. Yeah. My nitrates were zero. I'm like,
it's probably the same, but like, man, aquarium companies, just try a little bit. Again, the fruit is hanging so low, it's practically underground right now. Just do the most basic tests or demos. Just Sell me a story, like weave me a narrative of how you got to your logical conclusion, and then maybe we can take the bait a little bit easier. But I mean, every company talking about additives, water tests, tank clarity, lights, protein skimmers. There has been nothing done. Therefore, anything you do will be 1,000 times more than what we currently have. Don't just show me a decent reef tank. Just compare product A and B and C and yours. It would just take so little effort.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's sort of what pissed me off about LEDs for a long time, and why I did try LEDs early on, and then I backed away because the marketing and everything, and LEDs are great, and in the early iterations of LEDs, the harsh shadowing, the rainbow colors, I struggled, moving from metal halides, and it was like, look, this is not a like for like replacement. And I felt not betrayed, but I just felt frustrated, right? Like, it's like, you can't tell me these lights are as good as a metal halide. But then things did get better, right? Because behind the scenes, they were still chasing, right? They were still improving
they got better
iteratively.
on the backs of all their users.
Right.
Not
And that's
through their own like research and development. They released this stuff into the wild, and then they got some feedback and just collectively, aggregated that into better and better products. And as a technology kind of caught up, the
Yeah.
technology was very limited to begin with. But
But it pissed me off at first, right? Because it's like, look, this single unit doesn't replace a metal halide. I need 3 of these units, right?
Mhm.
And when these units were like $700-800 a piece or whatever, it was like, okay, you're losing the argument here. But now they are better, and now I'm full LED everything, and I'm happy. But again, that sort of goes to what you're saying. Like, we were the science testers, right? Like, we were the ones.
guinea pigs.
Yeah, and that frustrated me.
And here's another great point. It's like you can't do science unless you have the right tools, right? So the earliest par meters were not even designed to work with like narrow bandwidth LEDs, right? It was only like 5 years ago that Apogee put out a par meter that was suitable for broad spectrum lighting and multi peak lighting that we get with LEDs. And then as soon as I get that meter, I do a few tests, and they all of a sudden discover an immersion coefficient factor that dramatically alters the par value that you get in micromoles from different colors of lighting. It's like, man, come on, you guys. Even the par meter didn't work. This kind of goes back to what I was saying with the additive versus the ICP versus the ecology versus the biology, or what I said last session about pH electrodes, calibration solution, temperature baths, and then is your thermometer actually working? It's a lot of work to really, dot your I's and cross your T's and come up with a definitive result. It's very hard.
Yeah, I agree. It's
So
and I think what, like our last podcast about how it just makes everything harder on the hobbyist, right? It's interesting that to this day, I mean, how long have we been in this hobby? Ages, right? And we've seen we talked about reef keeping fads, and we've seen some come and go. But have we definitively seen something? Like the guy that just does a couple of water changes or does no water changes and feeds pellets and, who has a great looking reef tank. And then the guy over here who's running like 7 different dosers and all these additives. I still haven't seen this huge divide in results, right?
I actually have. What you're describing, there's almost a negative correlation between how much gear you have on a reef tank and how good your tank looks. Like, how many tanks have you seen that have like crazy like assembled rocks, built into intricate shapes, and then all the controllers and a specific board and all the wires and tubing routed up beautifully? Where is the tank? Where's the tank? I see these all the time on Instagram channels, Facebook groups, and YouTube, and then I will always go back and try to look for like the finished product, like with the livestock and stuff. It's almost never there. They don't even make it that far, right? But I think that's kind of a different topic. But yeah, there's definitely a negative correlation between.
But yeah, I mean, in the sense of progress, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, the technology has gotten better, right? For sure, and that's definitely been a upside. But I mean, all these bottles on a shelf and stuff, I haven't seen much. Well, okay, I take that back. Bacterial dosing, I think, was a new frontier, right? I think that I personally don't use it, but I think there's something to be said for the whole bacterial dosing regimen and bacteria in a bottle that's starting to gain some traction, and people are able to manage nitrates and all kinds of things. And like we talked about, now we're battling zero nitrates, right? We're battling a nutrient deficiency, and I wonder if part of that too is just we've definitely tuned the bacterial spectrum a bit in our reef tanks for processing a lot of that. So I'll give some credit there. I guess that's been a significant, I think, improvement. Like Razor, you and I both have used Razor. It's a polymer. That was actually interesting, right? Like that definitely cleaned my rocks, when I had an algae problem. So I don't want to discount all additives, but I don't know. Just some of it is, like you said, the
All right, so
proprietary thing gets in the way of the science a bit.
Very much so. And so, like, that's the great, like, stepping off point is some of these companies that have a lot of bacterial additive products. How many do you need? You're right. You got one for starting your tank. You got one for cleaning your rock. You have one for maintenance. It falls into like a broad category of products that don't hurt your reef tank, right? You're just basically selling an idea. How much is it really helping? I can totally get behind, like kickstarting the biological filter of your tank, right? The nitrifying filter of your tank. And then I can totally get behind a suite of microbes, because they're not just bacteria, that will help to break down detritus and organics in your tank. But why are certain companies have like 7, 8, 9, 15 different bacterial products? Like, I don't get it. I'm like, why do you have 15 different solutions? Are you just trying to micro market to all these different types of tanks? You got the nano solution, you got the fish tank, you got the reef tank, you have the live rock cleaner, the live sand cleaner. Why are those two different products? I don't know. But
and then they sell a medium with it, right? Which something for the bacteria to grow on, which my brain goes, why do you need that? But and then factor in that some of those people report aluminum leaching, and then others they don't. That'd be another thing to test. Is I'm gonna throw a bunch of these bricks in different tanks and we'll see what happens, right?
Yeah.
I don't want aluminum in my tank.
No.
All these ceramics
I refuse to use any ceramic ever again because I got burned. And it's not a reflection of what's currently on the market. But 10 years ago, I did a reefscape that was all ceramic. And it was a challenging reef tank as soon as it was like 2 weeks since I'd done a water change. And we didn't have ICP tests then. And I realized that the aluminum was leaching, the aluminum ceramic thing was leaching a bunch of silicate and aluminum. So it was like giving me crazy diatom blooms, and certain corals wouldn't live. And it would be like years later that I learned why I had so much problem with this tank. And I won't use ceramic of any kind. Not like militantly, but I do not want ceramic substrates. I do not want ceramic biomedia. I do not want ceramic plugs. I do not want ceramic rocks. I do have a couple small pieces of like ceramic aquascape that I've had outside in the weather for like 2 years. I'm almost on the cusp of thinking those things have been like totally leached and weathered away. But yeah, it's the onus is on these companies to prove that their stuff is safe or effective. And goodness, man, besides, certain companies be like, oh, our products are used the world over for X, Y, and Z. There's very, very little of this effectiveness research being done. We haven't even gotten into like full on science yet, right? Just show me tank A and tank B and one of those is doing better or worse depending on what product you're trying to promote.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
speaking of treatments,
Yeah.
you were talking about razor, and man, how long did it take for us to figure out that erythromycin as a red slime treatment was also kind of good at stopping certain types of wasting disease on corals, right? Fluconazol's been around forever, but how long did it take for us to connect the dots that it was going to kill Bryopsis, eradicate Bryopsis, and a few other things? Or Interceptor for Tagastes acroporanus, the red bugs. There has to be some other compounds or antibiotics or treatments out there that will maybe selectively kill monopore eating nudibranch or acro eating flatworms. I think one of the newest Hail Mary shots was probably like Phonomarin. I think they have one that's got like capsaicin in it, like chili pepper. I'm like, oh man, I want to believe that one. I really want to believe that one, like so bad, but I don't know, if somebody was just a little bit better or had a grasp of this stuff, they could probably find some treatments for some of these ailments that we experience. I'm still kind of a newbie at using ciprofloxacin for treating the consumption of anemones, where someone corrected me in the Reef Therapy comments that was the old name for tuberculosis, not for cancer. So shout out to that person. But man, I tell you what, the effect that I see in my anemones is not like it's getting rid of an infection. It's almost like there's some kind of crack in the ciprofloxacin that makes my anemones happier within like 12 hours. It does not make sense. And, every time I think I'm on, you're supposed to do like daily treatments for a week or something, but those are just starting points. So I'm doing a treatment every 3 to 4 days. And man, I'll tell you what, every time I dose ciprofloxacin, my anemones get happier and bigger, and I have fish in there. And I'm not even using carbon or doing like diligent water changes, because I understand how antibiotics actually break down in light and just being in solution for a long time. So there's so much low-hanging fruit when it comes to certain treatments for aquariums and reef aquariums that, like, man, there's a whole wide world there for the next generation to go and discover and tell us old timers about.
I agree. Yeah. And this goes back to our last conversation of like, I don't know, if you're a aquaculturist, man, edge yourself into a position where your corals are pathogen and pest free, It's like in the freshwater days, you didn't want the wild fish. You wanted the F1, the F2s, the disease-free fish. You didn't want the one that had worms that came out of the Amazon River. Anyway, you want to do one or you want me to do one? I got another one for you.
I think it's your turn.
All right, this one we've talked about before, but I want to talk about it in the context of actually testing it, and that's food, right? Both coral and fish food. I know a lot of people disagree with us on the pellet front. I saw a lot of comments about frozen food and how it's 99% water. And again, we're trying to move away from anecdotal, but I'll just say that on a personal level, the amount of algae on my glass 24 hours later is greatly different when I feed pellets every day. And when I just one day of the week, I say, I'm going to throw some frozen food in. I don't overfeed.
Talk to any freshwater or saltwater guy who's been keeping tanks for 5, 10 plus years. They treat their corals and their fish to frozen food, but their staple diet is almost without exception some kind of prepared foods such as flake or nori and or pellets.
And I don't have all the answers to it, right? But I just, that in itself would be fun to do more of a quantitative test on. But also it's just the efficacy of these foods, right? And this is where I wanted to, I'll give a shout out just because it spawned the idea. I saw in the Rising Tide Conservation Facebook post, where they're successfully breeding copper bands. Mm-hmm. And it was a shout out to one of their graduate students, Katie McCord, who defended her master's thesis. And her thesis was focused on using fluorescent microspheres to determine live prey preferences, right? And it was like, I didn't read, I couldn't drill into her, obviously her thesis, but if I'm interpreting that correctly, it's sort of like when they put barium in your body during a CT scan, or not barium, I think they use iodine now, but she was trying to figure out what these organisms are eating by using some kind of thing that she could trace, right? Or some fluorescent type of pigment that she could see, like, oh, they eat that one, right? That's my guess. If I'm wrong about her thesis, sorry, Facebook, there was no link. But it got me thinking, like, that is some scientific, well, I wanted to use a bad word there, but that's some science, like that's like, hey, we know that these larvae like to eat this, and that
only thing about that research is that the moment it's like knocking on the door of having a commercial application, you don't hear about it anymore, right? If she could use that research to raise bluefin tuna or food fish, or otherwise make a ton of money, all of a sudden, the initial papers are out there, but the follow-up research goes behind, not even a paywall. It just goes into a vault. Imagine just how much information and knowledge is, and science is known, but just has not been published because it's of value to somebody. That's sad. That's a bummer.
Well, they claim that it helped in their captive breeding of the copper band, so that's cool. But it got me thinking about like all these coral foods, and I've heard a lot that corals don't really care what the food is; they're more focused on the particle size. But again, if anybody has links to different articles, please, I will fully admit I haven't done my due diligence on this, but I am very skeptical about coral foods, admittedly,
I try not to name companies very often, but there's definitely like a fun, interesting banter between Benepets and Pellet Lab, because Benepets claims that their food has no phosphate in it. And I'm like, all right, well, if it doesn't have phosphate in it, it's not exactly food, right? You need adenosine triphosphate as energy, right? You literally need that. So, and all food has phosphate in it. So if it doesn't have phosphate in it, like, is it actually nutritious, or are they pulling that in from, the aquarium environment? Like, show me. That's two companies that, I'm not trying to get them to put their dukes up, but, those experiments would be super easy to perform, and this is one thing that I had is like one thing that we've mentioned many times, is like, how good is food compared to just a certain level of nutrients in the water, either in the form of nitrate, ammonium, phosphate, or dissolved organic carbon, or dissolved organic matter. Like, which one is actually best? Like, I don't actually know. I'm sure Jamie Craggs would tell you need some of those lipids and those fatty acids for corals to spawn, right? I believe that they eat in the wild just fine, but man, we're not trying to make corals exactly like the wild, right? Because if we did, we would just have corals growing on corals growing on corals, and it would be just a giant mess. But we need more of this very basic scientific understanding to move forward. At some point, man, all this marketing speak is gonna catch up with us, or is gonna catch up with somebody, and it's just, we're gonna stagnate.
Yeah, I'd like to see some experiments on that. And you could even dive into, because it's like, well, is your food good for SPS, LPS? Is the particle size right for all of those corals? Goniopora, like, I'd love that breath. I love to wake up in 30 years and we know 10 times more about, specific corals, right? And their preferences, right? Well, Gonioperas prefer this, and then, is the juice worth the squeeze? Yes, corals can be fed. Okay, but if it comes at the price of having just another import mechanism that I have to deal with export, but it's not ultimately necessary because they're getting fed enough from the tank conditions alone, then maybe it's okay for me to say, I'm not going to do it, right? I want to limit my import of nutrients because I'm also trying to maintain a proper chemistry and balance in my reef aquarium for everything to thrive, right? It's kind of like, And Jake likes hamburgers, but if you keep feeding him, somehow the conditions of the room that he lives in will worsen. It's like, ooh, okay, well, does Jake need those hamburgers, right? I mean,
Well, it gets
bad
it gets a lot more
metaphor because you
nuanced.
do need to eat, but like, it's
It gets a lot more simple than that, right? I had made the mistake of thinking that if I target fed my anemones and my LPS corals, that would be enough, right? If I'm hitting them once or twice a week with really chunky pellets, it shouldn't really matter what the nutrients are in the water. And I started bringing up my nutrients, and then I stopped feeding, and that just made all the difference. And I just feel like it's more of a feel-good thing for me to feed them. It's super fun to turn off the flow and just drop pellets on all the LPS. But if you have a large polyp, like if you have a scolemia or a disc coral, and you feed them a large pellet, they don't have the muscles in their gastric cavity to chew that up, right? So just because they ingest it, maybe they're just sucking off the juices right off all the exterior. But I have seen this before in my tanks and other people's tanks. You can feed them a ton of pellets or very large pellets or a big old piece of shrimp, and more than likely within 10 to 18 hours, they're going to like regurgitate that thing, just like barely dissolve on the surface, and you have this funk going everywhere. So I think the particle size one is a really important discussion to have.
But then what are these liquid additives like Red Sea that glows in the dark? Like, what the hell is that doing? Are they
I'll bet you
drinking
the
it?
glow in the dark part is just calcium. It's called calcium. It's a fluorescent form of something. I feel like that is for us. That's not for them. I feel like that is literally like pushing our psychology buttons and be like, ooh, look, you're adding this fluorescent stuff to your tank. It looks so cool. But I'll bet you that part is just like the color that's added to a bunch of different chemicals and additives just to make it look like it's not just simply water. Because I don't know for sure.
Like I said, I've tinkered. I'm not, I don't ignore this stuff and just, turn my nose at it. I've tinkered with a lot of these things, right? I have Polyp Lab. I have the Red Sea stuff. I tinkered with that for a while, and I did get a feeding response, right? Even the Red Sea stuff, my Blastos, my Colastrias, they all open up. But then I'm like, and then what? Like, it's a liquid that's diluted into the tank volume, and what is it doing? Like, I don't know. I would love to. Again, I get it, proprietary, trademark, secrets, but it's like, well, how did you guys come up with this glow-in-the-dark formula, and what is your basis for it doing something, right? And I watch their videos.
How hard would that
I watch
be?
all their videos on YouTube, and there's nothing there to, like, chew on. It's just
and
like...
they have that big old lab. Red
Yeah.
Sea has that big old lab that most of us learned about when they just introduced their new coral dip. That's another one. I'd love to see, like, a category that I'd love to see, like, really dove into. How do these different coral dips compare? And when you look at the marketing, the messaging for what they call it, Dip X, it just kind of sounds like, oh yeah, I was looking at the testimonials, and I was like, oh yeah, I love the way it smells. And someone said something about Pine Sol. I'm like, did they basically just recreate Revive and Coral RX? Don't risk it, dip it. Like, come on, man. And they have this huge lab. Like, just show us tank A, we fed Reef Nutrition AB+. This tank we fed brand A. This tank we fed brand B. This tank we fed live phytoplankton. Look at the startling difference. It's not that hard. You don't even have to give us actual data on the growth. Just show us how you treated these different tanks, probably in the same system, but with different foods.
Yeah, and we could pick it apart because it's like, well, maybe your food just breaks down into an available nutrient, and that's why. But who cares, right? Just show me this coral grew more than this coral. That'd be awesome. I would love that.
Absolutely.
All right, I got one more, but if you got another.
I have one big one that I've just been avoiding because it's just such a
All right, let's
sand
save
trap.
yours for last because mine I
Okay.
think is short.
All right.
Chemical warfare.
Ooh.
That crap comes up all the time. Oh, well, the reason your SPS are doing bad is because you have a large leather coral. Okay, and maybe they're right. I'd love to see some research on different soft corals, the amount of chemical warfare they produce, the impact it has to corals, whether carbon removes it, whether protein skimming removes it, whether it's actually a problem to begin with, or it's just something that people have repeated since the dawn of time.
Information that was propagated in, let's just say the early days of reef keeping, when people's tanks probably had a lot more soft corals and a lot more microalgae, and you had a lot of these terpenoids in the water. And like, all right, yeah, if you have a tank dominated by sarcophytnephtheas and derbesia algae, and your water's like physically
Pea-colored?
yellow,
Pea-colored?
not even visually, it's like physically yellow,
Yeah.
and you try to add a stony coral in there, yeah, maybe you might not love that, but those are extreme examples that I don't think reflect the environment that our corals are trying to grow in today. I have no doubt in a laboratory setting, it's kind of like the reverse science argument, right? It's like the LD50. You expose, critter organism A to this compound at this crazy level, but then your headline just says, oh, ivermectin treats, COVID or something, right? It's like, all right, yeah, maybe if you add enough ivermectin to an empty like colony of coronavirus, yeah, all right, maybe that'll kill it, but so will milk, right? If you add enough milk, I'm just reaching out there, but yeah, I don't know. And you hear these things get repeated over and over
Yes.
and over, and they might have been true 30 years ago when people's tanks were dominated by a completely different population of corals. But man, in the last 10 years, I've only seen like 2 or 3 tanks that were just so soft coral heavy that I looked at it and like, ooh, that might not be a great place to just plop an acro.
Yeah, I would love to just learn more about terpenoids, right? But the whole chemical, I heard people bring up like the very fluorescent green sinularias, right? Like, oh, those are notorious for chemical warfare. That big green Palau, Nepthy or whatever they want to call it these days, that's your problem. And I'm like, where's that? Like, really? Like, did somebody do some quantitative or chemical analysis? Or is it just because that coral glows in the dark, so you probably just think it's a toxic thing?
Confirmation bias, man. You just see it over and over and over again, and I think that's what has led people to believe or want to believe, right? This just desirable facts. People, you want things to be true, like, well, you have red bugs in your tank. All right, add some dragonface pipefish. That's just going to magically solve it. Flatworms, add a springer damselfish. You got vermitids. Bumblebee snails will do it. We actually got a comment on our last session about someone was saying that bumblebees just did not interact with his large population of vermitids at all. I'm just like, yeah,
They're pretty though.
that kind of sounds right. We've had bumblebees in the aquarium hobby for a long time, and they're just ornamental, and they're just kind of there. I'm not quite sure exactly what they eat, but if they did something to vermitids, I think someone would have noticed, a tangible connection long before now.
Yeah, and with the chemical thing, like if it's true, what is the most effective counter to it, right? Is it just some carbon and you're good? Is it protein skimming? I have a ton of softies and I have SBS, and I just have never encountered this issue, and I'm not the greatest. I used to not be the greatest guy about water
I see
changes.
more warfare between my soft corals. I'm talking about
See,
physical
you brought
touching.
that up, and that really got me curious. I would love to.
Dude, Capnella it's the strangest thing. I have this Capnella that will sting other Capnellas, that will sting other Sarcophytans. I'm like, how do you win? Why do you win? You have smaller, winker, limper polyps. And that Sarcophyton's got big, beefy, chunky polyps that I can really see. How is it that you're winning against a Sarcophyton or a Sinularia? I don't know. But I have enough big soft corals to be like, it's weird to see soft coral warfare between octocorals. That's one that just takes me by surprise every single time.
And that's where we could learn more too, right? Is like we know about sweeper tentacles and stony corals stinging the crap out of each other, but like I feel like the soft coral realm and their competition for space, maybe it's not a mystery. It's just maybe the scientific documents and the abstracts I just haven't paid enough attention or done due diligence there. But it's just every reef keeping book doesn't really dive into it, right? Like they
No, they
avoid
just
that
kind of,
subject.
parrot what's been said before about, oh, too many soft corals is going to kill your stony corals. And having seen natural reefs and very lush, mature reef tanks, you see no indication of soft coral compounds stunting stony coral growth.
I
That
think
just,
it's something that somebody speculated, like, hey, this might be an interesting theory, and then it just became repeated and repeated and
more, I
repeated.
mean, along those same lines, maybe it was actually a researcher who isolated the compounds from wild colonies of sarcophyton and then put this like concentrated mix on like delicate frags of acropora and was like, oh, that killed it. But like, yeah, but you were talking about the terpenoids from a wild colony. Like we know that like poison arrow frogs, they don't
I was
have the
about to
same
bring up,
toxicity.
they lose their toxicity in captivity, right?
Yeah, they don't have that because they don't eat the same kind of like fire ants or whatever. So they don't,
Yeah.
they don't have that bioaccumulation that might happen in nature. So there's some certain things that are true in nature which may not be true in our aquariums.
Truth.
Oh my goodness, I got the big ball. How about light?
Oh.
Light.
Okay.
Greg Carroll recently asked me if there was any publications that definitively showed what light is best for corals. And I literally didn't answer for like 2 or 3 days. I was thinking about it. I'm like, I don't even know how you would form that experiment because corals are adapted to totally different conditions. You got soft corals, you got stony coral, shallow water coral, deep water. You have broad spectrum, you have blue lighting. And so I don't think you can definitively even prove this light is better for that coral. I think it'd be much easier to demonstrate that, hey, green light's probably not the best. I think we know that one. I'm trying to remember. I had a light fixture, one of those early LED lights that had green in it. I don't remember which one it was, but I do remember when I would turn on the green channel, certain corals would straight close up.
Really? I've heard about
Yeah.
red. I know Dana Riddle did some good experiments with red wavelengths, red LEDs, and I believe I don't know. I don't want to misquote him, but
I remember that study. I know exactly which one you're talking
Yeah.
about. He was using tiny little LEDs and he was holding up reds against, just indicator LEDs. They were so small. So he had red LEDs against Poslepora and then blue LEDs against Poslepora. And the red LEDs seemed to have like a bleaching effect.
Mhm.
But he wasn't saying that they were worse. He was saying that they were actually more effective at driving photosynthesis. Therefore, the coral needed a lot less zooxanthellae in that region where it was exposed to the red light. And then the coral that was exposed to the blue indicator LED turned really, really pink. Right? So some of these experiments that you would want to do, if you put a bunch of red light of your corals and they got really pale, that doesn't mean it's worse light for them. Right? It just means it might be more photosynthetically
it's
active.
able to do more with less.
It does
right?
more work
Zooxanthellae.
with less, which doesn't make any sense because blue light is more energetic. But yeah, I think it's easier to just like dispel the wavelengths that don't work. I know there was some work on infrared LEDs. This was funny because it was based off of science because there's like a field effect in crops where certain wavelengths of infrared light stimulated them to grow in a particular way. I don't recall exactly, but if you know anything about infrared light is that it does not go through water. Obviously there's different wavelengths of infrared. Some infrared can go through water, but most of it bounces off the water. That's why when you're pointing your infrared temperature gun at your tank, you're literally measuring the temperature of the glass. Because you can't really, infrared doesn't penetrate materials, especially water, that way. So I think it's easier to just dispel some of the wavelengths that don't help than the ones that do. But then if you have a coral that's acclimated to red light, it's going to do better on red light than a coral that's acclimated under blue light, and vice versa. You know what I'm saying? So if you have a coral...
I have a theory that I can't prove, but yeah, anyway. That sort of touches on what you're saying, and that's the fact that so there's an argument that white light, which has more reds and greens, right, means you fight more nuisance algae, right? So there's that argument that a tank that's more on the bluer spectrum um, is easier to manage with corals. You don't deal with less algae issues. But okay, you're a freshwater planet guy. There's two approaches to planet tanks. One is a crap ton of light, but then you have to add a crap ton of CO2 in order for the plants, desirable plants, to be able to outcompete the algae, right? The other way is the low tech method, where you only go to, like, I think they say like 1 to 2 watts a gallon, and basically you leverage the adaptability of your plants to deal with less than ideal par, so that it has a competitive advantage over the algae. So my take on algae is algae's competitive advantage takes over when there's an excess of nutrients or an excess of light, right? So in a way, I kind of wonder if blue lit tanks, the Windex tanks, are sort of like the low light planet tanks, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
So it's this obsession with par, but I think you're kind of leveraging the adaptability of those corals to deal with a more narrow band of photosynthesis, right? Of available wavelengths, and that just gives it that competitive advantage over algae. But does that mean it's the best light?
I mean, I know enough about par to know that I don't even really know where you would start to answer some of these questions. I feel like it'd be easier to start discounting certain wavelengths of light that are not useful or that are detrimental as far as like growing nuisance algae versus corals and other things. But one thing that, less philosophical part, it would be, I've always said this about like, high energy blue light and near UV light is that there's one subset that shows those colors, and there's maybe like an overlap of those wavelengths that stimulates the fluorescent protein, colors and stuff. There's a lot of overlap between those two, but where does it end? How much does UV really, really matter? I don't know the answer, but this is what this whole conversation is about. Like, man, I wish the scientists would really take a look at captive aquarium ecosystems. The one thing that I do believe is really important that hasn't been talked nearly enough, I mean, it's been brought up a little bit, but not nearly enough, is people always ask me, what is your light program? And I'm like, do you know how long it would take me to write that out? Which wavelength I run for how long, at what intensity, at what times 6, 7, 10 different color channels? Like, what do you want me to do here? I don't know how to answer this in like a sentence. But one thing that is super important is daily light integral versus just single points of par. So DLI is used a lot for like crops. You can get like a small DLI meter for, I don't know, like 30, $40, put it out in your field, and you know exactly how much energy is hitting your crops throughout a season. And I feel the same way about reef tanks. It's less about what is that single point par value than the total number of photons hitting your coral every day. And we are so far away from beginning to have those kind of conversations because we can't even agree on what a refugium is or what specific coral names are, and I'm just like, everybody's, this is where the units for par really come in. Micromoles is a specific number and it hits a square meter every second. Boom, there's your par value. And then if you take the integral of the day, you can literally count up the number of photons that are hitting your coral or a given coral if it was a square meter. You know what I mean? And then you would have a beautiful, nice round number. And instead of asking, what's your program? You could be like, oh, what's your DLI? How many photons hit your coral every single day? Boom. Yeah. There you go. That's the real answer. And I remember seeing like a really brainy presentation in person about coral spawning. And this guy took the DLI of corals in different habitats around the world, and they always spawned after they reached a certain threshold. right? It's just like filling up your gas tank. They got enough energy through the season, and then the temperature or lunar cues triggered them, and boom, they were ready to spawn. It was like one of the most magical pieces of science I've ever seen. It was awesome.
Yeah, that's interesting. And again, shout out to the Planet guys. They would advocate that if you had lower budget lighting, just increase your time that your lights are on, right? Your photo period.
And then the last thing
Which-
that makes it really hard, this is pretty much my last point. The last thing that makes it very hard to understand the multidimensional question of like what kind of light, how long, how strong, which coral, is the Zooxanthellae living inside of our corals. And we do not know. We do not know that. And hopefully with better access to tools, the likes of which Aquabiomics is offering, we should be around the corner from being able to send in a small sample of coral and knowing which Zooxanthellae is inside of it. Because it's not the corals that are light sensitive per se, right? It's the Symbiodidium, the dinoflagellates inside of them that are doing all the heavy lifting. They're the ones that's reacting to the stuff. And the thing is, if you have a very large coral, you can have one type of Zooxanthellae on the top, another one on the side, and another one on the bottom, because they're all suited to different things, and there's small little ecosystems. And I think with that, man, we've gone off the deep end of like, what can science actually answer for us?
Yeah, I mean, the lighting pissing contests are good in the sense that they probably will improve the technology and push innovation. So that's good, but I feel like it's also sort of pointless. I mean, I think most of the lights sort of like I'm trying to get I don't know, I don't have a good example, but most of the lights will work just fine. Pick one you like.
It's very hard to
sometimes it's the
underlight-
user interface that's more important, right? It's like, oh, I like the app.
Absolutely. It's very hard to underlight corals these days.
Yeah.
Although I'm trying with my cheapo Amazon lights. I found a 10-watt light that didn't quite work. It looked good on paper,
promising.
and
I was
and then
yeah.
I put it on and I put the corals underneath. I'm like, what? I feel like my cell phone LED is brighter than that thing. That was weird. I'm like, I'm pretty sure I could switch out those LEDs for something much better, and it would be a lot less crappy for $25. That was kind of an interesting surprise. I had big hopes for that one, but yeah, I feel like if we could all collectively just get a little bit more scientific and have some of these discussions, we could move the needle in terms of what we can take to the bank or what we really, really, really know.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a wish list. Or wishful thinking is the word I'm looking for. It'd be awesome to have manufacturers and additive companies be like, well, here's our logic, right? Here's how we came up with this. We're not going to share the formula, but just here's how we attacked the problem, right? Like the problem is we want to feed corals. Okay, well, here's how we came to be where we're at. And yeah, I mean, if anybody that's listening has access to some good scientific abstracts on some good things that are related to these topics, I'd love to read them. Because we talk about recommending reef books, and I'd say the one fault I have with all the reef books is that sometimes they don't dive into that stuff as much. Some of them do. I mean, a lot of these books actually have in the back, right, the different abstracts or scientific articles, abstracts being the summary, of course.
Citations. They used to have a lot more citations.
A lot of citations, yes.
Reef Aquarium articles used to be loaded with citations.
Yeah.
I mean, you can look at FAMA at the very end of the articles in the in the 80s, 90s. You go to the bottom, there'd be like 3, 5, 12 references. So you could go like search for whatever it is they were saying and dig into whatever that research was. And now it's no, that's not even
It doesn't
close
help
to
that a lot
thing.
of that is behind a paywall too, right? Some of these places where you want to just
Sci-Hub
go
is
look
your
some-
friend, man. If it's less than a month, it's more than a month old, you will find it on Sci-Hub. I use Sci-Hub like almost every
For
single
free?
day. Oh, Sci-Hub. Well, I'm not going to get all into it, but it's just a collective of researchers that have made the papers available. And you go to
Oh, cool.
scihub.se, sci-hub.se, and they're constantly changing domains because I keep getting like shut out by different countries from being hosted in their country.
Never
But
mind.
no, Sci-Hub has been my jam for like 2 to 3 years to get behind those paywalls. And here's one little secret that's not so secret. Every researcher of those papers, there's nothing keeping them from sharing that paper with you. All they have to do is answer the email and respond, send you the PDF. And they are usually more than happy that someone gives a hoot about the research that they are doing, right? So just because it's published and it's on a paywall, that does not preclude them from sharing the paper directly with anyone. So if you're doing research on any of these topics we're talking about, go to Google Scholar and you find the author. At the very least, it'll give you their email, and you just email them up. And I mean, that is part of their job, is to share the science that they do.
Yeah, I think we talked about him before, and I'll give him a shout out at the end. Is that Reef Man guy on YouTube with the blue spotted angel?
Mm-hmm.
He does a lot of great videos where he takes some research or a scientific article and makes it a little more accessible, but something that he thinks the average reef hobbyist would find interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's nice, it's refreshing. It's I give him a credit for doing that. So.
Yeah, it's like a nice little stiff drink of facts.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it doesn't necessarily translate 1-to-1 from the ocean to our reef tanks, but it's a start. And that's all I'm asking for the reef aquarium world and the manufacturers, is just to start picking up these fruits sitting on the ground, demonstrate in the most like obtuse way possible, what does your product do? Like, show me how it does it just incrementally better than brand B or C. Please.
And your product might get better if the other guy's doing something better. You're gonna be like, well, crap. And not on the proprietary front, but if like people are testing and they're like, well, this A/B solution is much better at keeping trace elements in check.
Could you imagine if we had an arms race of like scientific marketing, where they were one-upping each other in how they could demonstrate that their product is legitimately better, instead of just knee-jerkingly putting it on the box and on the pamphlet or the website. So cool, man. Well, I think that we summed it up pretty well. There's a lot of research to be done. So if there's any like aspiring young scientists listening right now, there is a literal metric ton of PhDs out there waiting to be defended. So,
and if you're a billionaire and you can hire a bunch of those PhDs to do some of this stuff just for our own curiosity, that would be great too.
Yeah, and if you're rich enough, just like start your own scientific paper.
Start your own university. I don't know.
Yeah, no, don't even submit it to Nature or Science. Just start your own paper. Just be like Aquarium Sciences.
We got billionaires going to space, man. We need some billionaires that want to further the aquarium hobby.
Yeah, I mean, somebody needs to save the corals, right? This is the first step.
There you go.
Very cool. Awesome session of Reef Therapy, my man, Mark. Thanks for joining me. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcatcher, make sure to rate us. If you're watching/listening on YouTube, go ahead and put those comments down below. I think we're going to be ready for a nice little Q&A session on our next installment of Reef Therapy. So until next time, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you guys next week.
Talk to you then.
Bye, guys.